Previous Tears in the Fence festivals have explored a wide variety of poetic responses to a particular theme. This has been stimulating and enlightening, but necessarily narrow in focus. The scope of this year's festival is in a sense infinite, because we're celebrating poetry itself and the idiosyncrasies that all of us present display as poets. In Pride of Place, we're also celebrating those two eclectic poetic phenomena, the Tears in the Fence Journal and its annual festival. In this address, I shall be asking two questions. What is poetry, and what good does it do? We've got 3 weeks to do that. All I can manage in the brief time allowed, of course, is to scratch the surface of such an inquiry. When I've completed my scratching, Mo will share her thoughts on 40 years of Tears in the Fence. It's probably safe to assume that as soon as human beings had language, they told stories and sang songs, often combining the two. The first poems were probably rhythmic and repetitive pieces that matched the beat of clapping, stamping, and workaday activities. Musical instruments would have enhanced the performance of these compositions. Once a thing is invented, it often develops exponentially. Think of the mere 60 years between the first manned flight and that giant step for mankind on the surface of the moon. Depending on the resources of these first languages, humans no doubt quickly realized that words could be played with in order to entertain listeners, to move them, to console, to mock, and so on. All the purposes that we see in poets the world over today. In particular, poems and songs were used in a religious context, as our ancestors investigated and tried to come to terms with the world and the forces they perceived all around them. If Paleolithic Cro-Magnons could paint such masterpieces on the walls of caves, it's surely an acceptable leap of faith also to credit them with the verbal trickery required for poetic composition. Did they chant shamanistic songs in front of their representations of bison and antelopes? Were they the first to come up with metaphors or to experiment with alliteration? The roots of poetry may go back even further into the mists of unrecoverable history. The earliest known musical instrument is a Neanderthal bone flute dated at 60,000 years BCE. In its reconstructed form, it has a range of 2.5 octaves and is able to play many classical compositions. If the possibility of music does actually presuppose the existence of poetry, do we therefore have to think of the very first discussions about assonance and symbolism taking place at the fireside of a race of early men who exist now merely as a tiny percentage of modern European DNA? By the 3rd millennium BCE, we have the first evidence of literary compositions being written down. Perhaps the Sumerians drew no distinction between prose and poetry, but in the following composition, which is addressed to the hoe, the gardening hoe, an odd choice perhaps for the first ever composition we have, and which for convenience sake I shall refer to as a poem, we immediately spot devices we still use for artistic effect. The selection of related words, repetition, personification, and incantatory tone. It has even been suggested that the writer is satirical or simply enjoying a tongue twister, because the word al, hoe in Sumerian, is used as often as possible, as well as many noun or verb forms beginning with or merely containing the syllable al. This aspect of the poem cannot be translated into English, obviously. The extract runs, "The hoe makes everything prosper. The hoe makes everything flourish. The hoe is good barley. The hoe is an overseer. The hoe is brick molds. The hoe has made people exist. It builds the right kind of house. It cultivates the right kind of fields. It is the hoe that extends the good agricultural land. By the 7th century BCE in ancient Greece, we see in the figures of the Muses the codification of poetry, a sense that it has reached its final or perfect form and can be both described and prescribed. There are now rules arising from the confidence that it's possible to know exactly what poetry is, rather than being open to what it can be and might be at some time in the future. Poetry is now divided into categories, each under the aegis of a particular muse. We have polyhymnia, hymns, melpomene, tragic theatre, thalia, comedic theatre, which is also in prose, calliope, epic poetry, utopy, psalm and elegiac poetry, and erato, lyric poetry. And this is by now a world where literary compositions are written down and shared. Regrettably, later generations have too often given the literary definitions proposed in classical times the authority of the Ten Commandments. Aristotle's definition of tragedy is a case in point. We should never forget that the literature of any society is a manifestation of its culture and values at a given period, and a response to the particular resources of its language. The many uses of the syllable al in the poem about the hoe cannot be caught in an English translation. Similarly, how can a speaker of another language understand the wordplay employed in a poem composed in Chinese, Inuit, or one of the click languages of Africa if we simply read it in translation? And most poetry we read from other cultures is likely to be in translation. There's an element of local colour that must always be beyond our reach unless we acquire a thorough knowledge of the language in question. The effect in general terms of the poetry written in, say, Arabic or Nahuatl, the Aztec language, may well be the same, but the specific linguistic tropes employed must remain elusive. Our definition of poetry, therefore, must always allow space for that of which we currently have no knowledge. So what are these effects in general terms that poetry can have on us? We may feel that the best poetry is somehow more elevated than prose. It can open our minds, our eyes and hearts. It can demonstrate the wonderful resources of our language, thrilling us perhaps with its daring, invention and resourcefulness. Poets often find new ways of expressing thoughts and experiences, and by doing so, undermine rigid definitions of the art. Oftentimes, a poet's choice of words is so special to us that we learn whole lines by heart. Two lines which come immediately to mind for me, for example, are "When in despair with fortune and men's eyes," a poet's response to endless rejections, perhaps. Or "Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness." In The Art of English Poesy of 1589, George Putnam described poetry as a manner of utterance more eloquent and rhetorical than ordinary prose which we use in our daily talk, because it is decked and set out with all manner of fresh colours, which maketh that it sooner inveigleth the judgment of man. This is a definition entirely of its time, when classical models held sway, and for some scholars at least, unrhymed quantitative verse following the Latin model was the gold standard. In some quarters, rhyme was too demotic, even though it is unarguable that English, with its influx of vocabulary from many other languages, contains an abundance of rhymes. In addition, English is a stress language, which easily falls into iambic or trochaic meters and is absolutely not a quantitative language nor regularly tonal like ancient Greek. Putnam was happy to go along with the natural genius of the language, but pedants like Gabriel Harvey clung to their Latinate hexameters, ugly sister feet squashed into a Germanic language's glass slipper. If we take Putnam's fresh colours as one corner of an ever-expanding paint box of poetic techniques, then we can accept his definition of poetry in general terms. His colours may have been those of classical rhetoric, but when we translate the names of the rhetorical tricks, we find they're no more than our well-known contrast, repetition, climax, exaggeration, personification, metaphor, simile, the part for the whole, and so on. Old definitions die hard, and I don't question the validity of Putnam's vision, merely its assumption that the definition of poetry was fixed. During the course of my teaching career, I often heard pupils say that poetry has to rhyme, and they expected a regular metrical pattern, even though they couldn't articulate their demand in technical terms. They could, however, hear it because they were still thinking of poetry as song. On a personal note, I have to admit that although I don't find it difficult to write in a regular metre and with the use of a rhyme scheme, the end result all too often is an unsatisfactory pastiche, which I would not dream of submitting to magazine editors. We should never forget that although much of the greatest poetry in English makes use of rhyme, it is not a mainstay of many other languages. Irish and modern Greek, two languages of which I have some knowledge, by their very wordscapes, do not lend themselves to rhyme. When I read translations from other languages, I'm aware that I'm missing something vital, the musicality, the sound patterns, which exist in this language alone. Images do translate, however, which is why certain foreign poets have become popular in their English versions. I'm thinking of Li Po, a Chinese poet of the 8th century Tang dynasty, and of Constantine Cavafy, an Alexandrian poet who lived from 1863 to 1933. So I'm going to read a poem by each of those. This is Quiet Night Thoughts by Li Po. Before my bed there is bright moonlight, so that it seems like frost on the ground. Lifting my head, I watch the bright moon. Lowering my head, I dream that I'm home. Apparently this is one of the best known Chinese poems, and I think anyone who is homesick would respond to those lines. And here's one by Constantine Cavafy. It's called Longings. Like the beautiful bodies of those who died before growing old, sadly shut away in a sumptuous mausoleum, roses by the head, jasmine at the feet. So appear longings that have passed without being satisfied, not one of them granted. Not one of them granted a single night of pleasure or one of its radiant mornings. As ever, Cavafy captures the pathos of aspiration leading to total failure. So many of his poems have that. Let's just find the next page. Some poets here today probably have paint boxes which are very radical in comparison with Putnam's. He might have accepted the visual effect of George Herbert's Easter Wings. The Easter Wings poem goes like that. A poem written some decades after Putnam's death, but he would probably have seen nothing but madness in the performance and visual work which is mainstream today. By chance, a Tears in the Fence blog published this week contains a review of a work which is modern paint box to a T. In his Bard Code, Gregory Betts, according to his reviewer Rupert Lloydell, has translated the sounds in Shakespeare's sonnets into colours and each of the 154 poems into grids, highlighting not only the syllable count and Shakespeare's playful disruption of it at times, but also the numerous rhymes throughout all the poems. What are we to make of this? Lloydell suggests a range of possible interpretations. He asks, are the grids of coloured squares in this hardback book visual art, conceptual writing, a scenic writing, concrete poetry, or a Shakespearean joke. Whatever they are, Lloydell acknowledges the sheer beauty and complexity of the work. We all write because we have to, and because we think that poetry is important. Coincidentally, the editorials of some recent issues of poetry magazines have raised the question of the value of poetry. Danielle Hope offers an eloquent assessment in Acumen 108. She writes that poetry perhaps encourages us to slow down, to savour the words, the silences between words, their music, sounds and secret meanings, to find deeper connections, comfort, courage or more. Plato found poetry too free, anarchic and subversive, all the qualities for which we perhaps value it. Poets were dangerous in Plato's eyes, and they would be banned from his ideal republic. He valued only truth, gained after a process of logical deduction. In his poem Lamia, John Keats deplores this destructive power of philosophy, which would sweep aside a being who is morally ambivalent, though beautiful, and he encapsulates his own perspective in the wonderful and enigmatic final lines of his Odes on a Grecian urn. Beauty is truth. Truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know. Perhaps it's the task of poets to bring to people's minds the truth and beauty of the world, although W.H. Auden somewhat disingenuously suggested that poetry makes nothing happen. But we always have the firebrand Shelley's counterclaim that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. I'm going to end this address with neither politics nor philosophy, but with an expression of the sheer delight of writing poetry. These are the words of John Clare, who simply could not stop himself writing poems. They were his reason for being. This is taken from his unpublished long poem, The Progress of Rhyme. I looked on poesy like a friend, to cheer me till my life should end. 'Twas like a parent's first regard, and love when beauty's voice was heard. 'Twas joy, 'twas hope, and maybe fear, but still was rapture everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. And now I'd like to introduce... Yes, I want to test it first. Can everybody hear this?
Yes.
Is that okay? I'll have to adjust it for you. Okay. Morag Kiziewicz.
All here today. It's so lovely, old friends of you, and such a good community, which Aidan was talking about this morning, and I totally agree. So it's a real privilege to celebrate Tears in the Fence. It's 40. This is the very first edition which we based the flyer on, and it was, as you can see, a homespun thing to begin with a remarkable committed group of individuals that kept it going through some troubled times, as I gather. I was around the backstage, but those who've read my shameless plug, Walk in Deep Time, will know that it had a fundamental influence on me. My son celebrated his 40th birthday this year, and as I looked through the Tears in the Fence issues from the very first one, I realised what an important strand it has been in our lives. I first came across the journal when my son was 10 and we were living in Tarrant Launceston. Andrew Hennon encouraged me to join the East Street Poets, hosted by David Cuddy in Bradford Forum. Val Bridges, among others, was already there, and Jay Ramsey and John Freeman were closely connected. Having a creative community with whom to share faltering early attempts at poetry is a joy. These knowledgeable, kind and considerate critics who knew how to guide you without putting you down was essential for a pre-computer dyslexic and dyspraxic writer. My writing voice had been silenced for so long, and to find a group of poets who embraced diversity and inclusion and valued difference over the other was a rare find in 1995, especially in the then somewhat non-inclusive North Dorset. In our naivety, the international reach and importance of the magazine only gradually became clear to us. The early Wessex poetry festivals, including memorable readings from renowned poets, and both Norman and Val referred to those yesterday, with great memories from you both. And through them, we became aware of the academic depth and reach of this internationalist literary journal. The focus of the magazine, on a love of language, literature, critical reviews and independent thought on the contemporary poetry scene, was both controversial and vital. It served, like the grit and the oyster, to enliven poetic debate and risk-taking in language development. The magazine helped to launch the early careers of many, and I'm not the only poet who has been enabled to find their writing voice and to be heard by the sensitive editorship of the magazine. All of us here probably know to have an acceptance for their writing in Tears and Offence is a prestigious and much valued experience. The Tears and Offence website describes how our central focus stems from the political and social-economic predicaments of the individual in relation to his/her historical and geographical landscape. The power of poetry to engage slantwise with social and political debate is well recognised and probably central to the Tears and Offence, and the importance of other languages and translation between has always been included. In those subtleties and shifts of sound and meaning, we reach a greater depth of understanding and communication. When I looked through old copies of the magazine, in every issue, open on random pages, I found poems that reached straight to the heart, or words from poets who have died, remaining like shadow leaves, reminding us of what is important, or words that took me into the culture of water-home lands and spoke of trees or bread. To produce an independent literary magazine of this quality, there's the next version, which we'll probably all remember, clearly requires a team. Westrow Cooper's commitment and engagement with poetry and the importance of how it is presented on the page underpins the design of the magazine. It's fundamentally important. Westrow and David Caddy's attention to detail, steadfast production in the face of many challenges, respect for every contributor, and the beautiful covers make the arrival of the magazines in our letterboxes a special treat. Their extraordinary contribution to the world of poetry and their hard work ensures the magazine endures and does reach us, and its power cannot be underestimated. Of course, the team of associate editors over the years have all played a vital, valued and much appreciated role. Each editor brings new perspectives and energises the contents. Currently, these are Louise Busher, Jennifer K. Dick, Richard Foreman, Joanna Nissel and Olivia Tuck. I must also give special mention to Sarah Hopkins, who was an editor from the very beginning. And to all our interns over the years, currently Samuel Borman, our thanks go out to them. And of course, to all of us, the contributors. The simple fact is that the world of independent magazines is increasingly under threat, and Tears and Offence would not exist without David Caddy's resilience and his remarkable love for and knowledge and insight into the world of literature and poetry. Thank you, David. Happy birthday, Tears and Offence.